Thank you for joining us. My name is Katherine Kelaidis, and this is the National Hellenic Museum's online lecture series. Of course, this is something we started doing when we transitioned to a COVID world. And today I am very honored to be joined by Professor Alexander Kitroeff, who is currently Professor of History at Haverford College in Pennsylvania. So today is November 5th, and he is in Pennsylvania. So he's at the center of, he's joining us from the center of the world at the moment. He was born in Athens, the other center of the world, really, if you think about it, and studied in the UK, where he received his doctorate in modern history from Oxford in 1984. Before he was at Harvard College, Professor Kitroeff taught at the American College in Greece, college year in Athens, the Onassis Center for Hellenic Studies at New York University, the Hellenic program at Princeton University, Temple University, and the Center for Byzantine and Modern Studies at Queens College, CUNY. Oh, excuse me, allergies, not COVID. And this is not a good time to have seasonal allergies, but
Indeed.
Professor Kitroeff has collaborated as historical consultant with director Maria Iliou on 5 documentaries screened at the Benaki Museum in Athens. He has published 6 books, including The Greeks in Egypt, 1919 to 1937, Ethnicity and Class, and Grigorios in America. But today we're here to talk about his most recent book, Greek Orthodoxy in America, A Modern History. And I am so glad he could join us. All my nerdy Orthodox studies and Greek studies friends were very excited about this book. So I am very happy that you can join us. And I think you're going to start by telling us a little bit about how you wrote the book and things. Is that correct?
Correct. First of all, thank you so much, Katie, for the invitation. I have been to the museum and I've used its resources, and I count myself as a friend and an admirer of the museum. And yeah, sure, I would have probably loved to have been able to come there and talk to you directly, but here we are. During the pandemic, and this is still a wonderful opportunity.
We owe you a speaker's drink at some point, I think. So
yes, exactly. Nice.
Hit us up for that later.
Yes. So what I thought might be fun to do is for me to talk just a little bit about how the book came about. The background to the book, and then we could talk about the book itself. So
Wonderful.
I've got a short PowerPoint presentation. It's 15 slides, and I'll talk about them. So here's the little clumsiness of sharing one's screen and getting the PowerPoint up. Good, it's up.
That was very efficient.
It's teaching Zoom classes day in, day out. That's what it does to you. So here's the book, and I'll talk about the cover a little in a little while. But so it's the Greek Orthodox Church in America, and I think the first thing I've got to say is that I am an immigration historian. That is, I study Greek Americans, Greek diaspora, Greek immigration. I am not a church historian. Therefore, the way I've looked at the church is by looking at the church as a social and cultural institution and looking at its relationship with the Greek American community. So I don't go into the more specific canonical stuff, because that's the job of church historians, and many of them have done a very good job. There are several very good books on Greek Orthodoxy in the English-speaking world and in America. So those are the books one should consult for the more narrow canonical stuff. So the reason or the inspiration I had in writing the book was connected with the documentaries you mentioned. As you said, I've collaborated on several documentaries with film director Maria Iliou. This was the first one, The Journey, the Greek American Dream, which came out in 2007, and it premiered at the Benaki Museum in Athens and at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. And in the course of researching and participating in the documentary, it was an opportunity for me to think about the Greek American community. And, it was clear to me that the church plays a central role in the history of Greek America. And the actual segment on the church in the documentary was handled by Father Robert Stephanopoulos, because I told Maria, look, the church is very important, but I haven't really researched the church as others, so let's get Father Robert, who was in New York, to talk about the church in that segment. But in the wake of the documentary, I was struck by the need to do something about the church and the community. And there were two coincidences. After the premiere at the Metropolitan Museum, I remember Father Alex Karloutsos came up to me and said, "You've got to write a biography of Archbishop Iakovos. It's a very important thing." And a few years later, the Greek General Consul in New York, Katerina Boura, who I had met as a historian when we were students in England a long time ago, she told me also, the Archbishop had retired, but she said, you're interested in the Greek Americans. The Archbishop is really the figure that you should be focusing on. In looking at the possibility of writing about the Archbishop, I realized there wasn't more of a cornerstone basic study of the church and the community, which would then enable me to focus on the Archbishop. So I got a grant proposal together to produce a history of the church, which would of course include a lot of Archbishop Iakovos. And I was extremely fortunate because I got a generous grant from the Jaharis Family Foundation, and which enabled me to stay in New York and do the research in New York. Staying in New York is an expensive proposition. I'm just outside Philadelphia, but commuting up there 2 hours up and 2 hours down wasn't going to do it. And it's my regret is that Michael Jaharis passed away in February of 2016. Unfortunately, as I was still researching and writing the book, I would have loved for Mr. Jaharis to have been able to see the book. The other members of his family, including Mary Jaharis, I think have seen it. I go to the island of Lesbos, Mytilene, quite frequently. Mr. Jaharis's parents were immigrants from the village of Agia Paraskevi, and I made a point of going to Agia Paraskevi, taking a selfie under the road sign of Mr. Michael Jaharis and Mary Jaharis, Odos Emmanuel και Mary Zachari in Agia Paraskevi in Lesbos. They're the home village of Michael's parents, and one that they have built an old people's home and helped the village in a number of ways. There were others who helped. My first thanks go to the Jaharis Foundation. Father Robert was extremely helpful. Father Robert had retired from the Archdiocese from being the priest at the cathedral in New York, but he still had a huge library and used to go there in the mornings. So when I was in New York, I used to go there. We used to hang out and he lent me books, he gifted books, he generously shared his knowledge. Here he is in a photograph, of course, with his son, George Stephanopoulos, who most people might say is the biggest star of the family, but I think Father Robert is the biggest star, and Presbytera Niki as well, which is in the picture. Presbytera Niki has actually written an excellent short history of Archbishop Michael, who was the Archbishop in the 1950s, and it's a Archdiocese publication. So Father Stephanopoulos was very, very helpful, and it was so wonderful just being able to hang out in this library with all the books and just casually ask him things and chat. It was really wonderful. But the real work was done in the archives of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese at its headquarters on 79th Street in Manhattan. And the person who was the most important in helping me, my thanks obviously to former Archbishop Demetrios, who gave me access, but the lady in red who's in the photograph here is Mrs. Niki Calais. This is a while ago, but Niki Calais is still as sharp-minded and elegant as she looks in this photograph. Niki Calais is in charge of the archives of the Archdiocese and helps all researchers. I must say, there was countless of times I just stopped and said, you know, Niki, you've got to write a book. You've got to write the history, because she was for many, many years the secretary of, closely associated and working closely with Archbishop Iakovos, who's here in the picture. So she saw and she saw everything that was going on. And after the Archbishop's retirement, she became in charge of the archives. So this was a wonderful thing for me. Here are the headquarters on 79th Street, and the archives are in the basement. And those archives, I should mention, have been PDF'd. First of all, the archives are wonderful. The church has preserved everything. It's an archive of Greek America because it's got so much information. And a lot of things are PDF'd. Most things are PDF, not quite digitalized, but PDFs, thanks to a grant of the Niarchos Foundation. So that was extremely helpful. And I think both the archive and Niki Calais are going to play a huge role. In a couple of years, 1922 is the centenary of the establishment of the Archdiocese. Obviously, our church, Greek Orthodox churches, there was one formed in New Orleans in the second half of the 19th century. A lot of churches were established in the early 20th century, including churches in Chicago, of course. But the Archdiocese acquired its governing body in 1922, the Archdiocese. And living in New York, I didn't restrict myself to visiting the Archdiocese archives, but I was able to visit the many other churches that exist in Manhattan. And coincidentally, this was the closest church to where I was living, which was on the west side, St. Gerasimos, which was important for me because my mother's family is from Kefalonia, patron Saint Gerasimos. And of course, the Kefalonites established this church a while ago. None of them live around the area anymore. I think they all come in from New Jersey on Sundays for the liturgy. Another extraordinary church that I had the opportunity to visit when I was in Manhattan is a Greek Orthodox church in the middle, or at least on the edge of Chinatown. And it just, you know, it shows you the history of the Greek presence, that the Greeks were there before Chinatown became Chinatown. It's somewhere between Chinatown and the Lower East Side. And the church is still functioning and working. And again, I think most people come in from Brooklyn and Long Island on Sundays. Finally, let me also transition now to the issues that I was looking at the book. I visited the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox National Shrine. As we know, there was a great deal of, there were many issues associated with its reconstruction. And luckily, everything now is in order and the church is being built as a national shrine. And this was, I discuss this at the end of my book. My book really covers the 20th century. I have a small section on the 21st century. The book discusses the trajectory of the church, a historical trajectory, which I would say is a trajectory that tracks the gradual Americanization of the Greek American community, but retains its old world ties and its Orthodox, Greek Orthodox integrity. But the church is Americanizing steadily. And I think this wonderful idea that St. Nicholas Church, which was destroyed during 9/11 because it was at the foot of the Twin Towers, the idea of not just doing a Greek Orthodox church, but doing a national shrine, which would be open to all for worship, I think shows the confidence of Greek Orthodoxy and the fact that it feels very, very much at home in America and is confident enough to open up its doors and say, let's everyone come and let's worship together. The trajectory of Americanization, before that started, the church needed Archbishop Athinagoras to arrive. Athinagoras came in 1931, and he was enthroned. Coincidentally, what happened was that the cathedral in the Upper East Side of New York they were doing repairs there. Athinagoras arrived in 1931, appointed by the Ecumenical Patriarch, and he was enthroned in another church, Agios Eleftherios, which is near the Chelsea neighborhood on the lower west side of Manhattan, and there's a bust of Athinagoras and this plaque that commemorates the event. Before Athinagoras came, that period from the establishment of the Archdiocese from 1922 to 1931 was problematic for the church because it was closely tied with Greece. Greece was polarized between Venizelists and royalists. The Venizelists were the prime minister's followers, the royalists, the kings. And guess what? Our churches became divided, and it was a very difficult period. Athinagoras came, and the church overcame its internal divisions. And one important thing that Athinagoras did was to make sure that the local parish became the main Greek American body locally. Before, the communities ran the churches, and in most other Greek diaspora communities, including the Greeks in Egypt, Alexandria, the community administers the church. Here in America, thanks to Athinagoras, it's the other way around. The community is basically the board of the parish. It's a technical detail, but it's very important because it enables the church to administer not only the community, but the philanthropical organizations through the Philoptochos and the schools. You could, actually, I have argued that that's wonderful, but it's also a huge burden on the church because it's almost as if the church is doing too much. But I gave due credit to Athinagoras in the book and the way that he, in a sense, set the foundations of the church. I've got 3 or 4 chapters here on Archbishop Iakovos. Archbishop Iakovos was the Archbishop from 1959 to 1996 when he stepped down. This photograph sums up Iakovos for anyone who just wants a soundbite about Iakovos. This is Iakovos giving an award to Andy Athens, the prominent Greek-American industrialist from Chicago, with Archbishop Macarius of Cyprus on the podium. And the event, of course, is taking place in the Waldorf Astoria, the Waldorf Astoria. Archbishop Iakovos would not deign to have events anywhere else aside from the Waldorf Astoria, because he thought the status of the church was such that it should be seen as holding its events in the Waldorf Astoria. And this photograph in many ways shows Iakovos's connections with the Greek American community and the wealthy Greek Americans, such as Andy Athens, and his connection with politics. And here we see Archbishop Macarius. The long tenure of Archbishop Macarius included many important moments for the church. There was an issue over the language of the liturgy in 1970, which created a furor. And then there was the Ligonia Conference in 1994 that considered steps towards a pan-Orthodox American church, which were reversed. So there was Iakovos also built the church and was present at important turning points of its history. Another thing, another aspect of looking at the church, aside from looking at the archbishops, which of course play a huge role, I was looking at the main functions of the church. And this is just an example of the many publications and reports we have on education. This is a report on of the education department of the Archdiocese from 1937 to 1938. There are colleagues who are focusing on the church and education in America. It merits not just one, but 2, 3 books. The church's connection with Greek language education is very, very strong. The other thing another thing which was very important and sometimes is overlooked is the role of women in the church. This is a wonderful photograph of the women of Agios Eleftherios Church in Lower West Manhattan, and they are working on the Epitaphios procession. And it's a great photograph because they said, yeah, sure, you can take photographs. And I started taking 2, 3, 4. And, I think the lady right at the top said, how many is this? What is this guy doing? So she gave me a kind of this look I got. This is one of my favorite photographs. The women, of course, officially are not part of the church, but they are so important in daily church life, in the Philoptochos, and of course, in the famous Greek festivals that churches use as fundraisers. If it were not for the volunteer work of thousands of Greek Orthodox women throughout America who spend hours preparing the foods of these Greek festivals, if it were not for them, there would be no significant fundraising for the church. So although I was looking at the church and the archbishops, obviously, and I was doing an overview, I made sure I discussed the role of women in the church as much as possible. And finally, I said before I discussed the cover of the book, and it's a wonderful coincidence. This is St. Catherine's Church. It's in Astoria, and I've gone around taking a lot of photographs of a lot of churches, and I sent them to the publishers, and the one on the left, they chose the one on the left for the cover of the church. But the wonderful coincidence is that when I first arrived in the United States in 1986, I spent 2 years living in Astoria on the same street as this church. So it was a wonderful kind of coming back to the roots and closing the circle of my presence. And so that's how this is my take on how the book was written. And I'll stop sharing and come on again.
No wonder, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm really struck by, when I was reading the book, which is absolutely brilliant, and we'll put a link down below. I think that's what YouTubers do. So we'll put a link down below if you want to, if someone wants to find the
Lovely,
book.
thank you.
Cairo, we're gonna put a link down below. She does all the technical stuff, not me, because that would be bad. One of the things that struck me when I was reading the book was this sort of tension, I guess, for the church, right? If the church is going to be the sort of ethnarch of the Greek community in America, how does that correspond to its mission, its sort of evangelizing mission, right? Like the sort of mission of the church. And I think that's something in American Orthodox circles has become more and more pronounced as, for example, the Antiochian Archdiocese has had this huge influx of converts that has genuinely changed the culture of those archdioceses. The same in the OCA. Of course, the OCA seminary now, I think the whole of the leadership is from non-traditionally Orthodox backgrounds. So in that way, the Greek Archdiocese is distinct. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Katie. It is distinct, and there's an ongoing tension between its religious and its ethnic identities, and this was the crisis, the Ligonia crisis of 1994. Ligonia is a place in Western Pennsylvania where the Antiochian Church has a retreat, and that's where all the metropolitans of all the ethnic national Eastern Orthodox churches had a 2-day meeting to discuss the possibility of creating an American Orthodox church. And that alarmed the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the process was not reversed, but slowed down dramatically. Let me choose my words carefully. And Archbishop Iakovos stepped down. And I think the Ecumenical Patriarchate was concerned that that process would have gone on too quickly, and it may have severed the ties with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And I think the concern is, I think there's an understanding that the ethnic elements are going to gradually dissolve as we go through time. But I think there was a concern. The concern is that the Ecumenical Patriarchate wants to retain its close ties with American Orthodoxy, even if American Orthodoxy is not becoming as quote unquote ethnic. The tension is there. There's also the canonical side of it. It's the Greek language. The Greek language was the language of the church, or is the language of the church. So to what extent do you want to turn your back on the Greek language? And for the moment, at least, most of the Greek Orthodox are Greek Americans. Maybe sometime in the future, when there are as many American Orthodox as Greek American, then dissolving the ethnic ties will be easier than they are now. I also think we should distinguish between I know that there are Greek flags, and there's a Greek flag in the cover of the book. But I think the point is that it's Greek culture and civilization rather than the Greece and the Greek state, which are being, the connection is with that rather than the Greek state.
Well, I think that's an important feature of the Greek diaspora, right? That the Greek diaspora predates, in many cases, the Greek state. And so, I mean, the Greek diaspora is ancient, right? The Greek state is a couple hundred years old. 199 years old, I guess, but who knows? It's 2020. Who knows if we'll get there? But I think that the idea of, I think it makes it, I mean, I would say, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, I think that makes those ethnic ties even harder to sever, because this isn't about sort of loyalty to a mother country that then you sort of grow away from. This is about Hellenism, for lack of a better, like this Hellenic identity that has historically transcended the nation state.
Exactly. Yes. So it's this, yes, let's say, yes, rather than Greek of Greece, it's Hellenic. There's a global Greek culture, which we call Hellenic, and that's present there as well. And is much stronger than maybe in the other Eastern Orthodox churches. You were going to...
I had this, and maybe you have some. I was at a conference about an American, I think an OCL conference. I can't remember exactly now. And there was a man there who I think had been drugged along in the great tradition of the Greeks, had been drugged along by his wife to witness this. And people were talking, and when these were people predominantly in favor of American Orthodox Church, right? A kind of de-ethnicized church. And when he said, I don't want that. And he almost was crying. There was a lot of emotion in his voice. And he said, if we do that, where will they learn Greek? Where will they learn Greek dancing? My grandchildren will be, and this is the part that struck me, my grandchildren will be lost to Hellenism.
Yes. Yes, indeed, they will be lost. And this takes us back to this historical moment with Athinagoras, when the church takes over all the activity. It becomes the parish becomes the local community, which is both good and bad. And I think now we see the tensions are present, because it would be perfectly fine to have a Greek school run by not the church, by some other organization. The church could have it could have its Sunday schools, and the Sunday schools could teach Greek to some extent, or to a great extent, but the actual Greek language, which would be more complex and challenging, might be the work of the schools. The Archdiocese had a debate about that before Athinagoras came in.
Oh.
In the 1920s, they had a debate as to, should we focus on schools or should we focus on Sunday schools, language schools or Sunday schools. And there was a very interesting debate.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I think, for fear of creating divisions, when Athinagoras came in, he said, look, we're going to do everything. We're big tent here, because we need to unite these royalists and Venizelists. We're going to do everything. We're going to bring everyone in. And that's what's happened. But they've been debates continuously. And you mentioned the OCL, and I must say the OCL archives and a couple of thinkers of the OCL were very helpful in my work. Peter Marudas in Baltimore, we sat down, spoke for hours. I benefited from Andrew Copen's writing, and also James Kunelis, another intellectual of the church. These debates that are going on, speaking as an immigration historian now, are sophisticated. There's a sophistication in the discourse that exists, and I know maybe that there's tension and people have differing opinions, but speaking as an immigration historian, I think it's a healthy debate with intellectual heft, and that in itself, I think, is a good thing.
I think it's important to have, and one of the things that it's sort of, I've been thinking about a lot this week is the ways, America is very, this kind of leads into my next question. America is very regionally divided in some very real and prescient ways. And I wonder if you could address the sort of regional divisions within the Greek community in America. Because I grew up in Denver, kind of out of that Intermountain West. Grandparents are out of Carbon County, like that kind of tradition. And when I moved to Chicago, I was like, whoa, this is not what I was expecting, in a lovely way. You're all lovely. But I mean, joking aside, it was a completely different kind of Greek community and culture. I wonder if you could address those kind of regional differences and how the church has responded differently in those contexts. I know that's a big question.
Yes, no, it's a great question. I mean, there's two ways, two elements to any answer to that question. First of all, there are the regional differences that, in a sense, reflect the regional differences that America has, because, as we know, this country's got different political and cultural orientations depending on whether you're in the mid-south, the east, the west, or wherever you are. That's one. The other thing is, the interesting thing with the Greek Americans is that although we've got this massive emigration from the 1890s through the 1920s, and then America restricts emigration and opens its doors really in the 1960s. At that time, we have a new influx of Greeks who come. It's not the case with other so-called white ethnic groups. There's not a big move from Poland. There are some Italians who come, but not that many. The Greeks get this kind of influx of Greeks in the 70s. And those Greeks settle mainly in New York and Astoria. And I think they, to a certain extent, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia. So you've got differences in terms of region and differences in terms of whether you're first, second, third, or fourth generation Greek. Yeah. And you can have a place in, here in Philadelphia, you could have someone who's Greek born and you could have someone who's third, fourth generation, that they came in the early century. Now, the regional differences appear in the church's history in a very interesting way. There is a clergy laity congress in 1982 that takes place in San Francisco. Now, by shorthand, the way one could study the church as an overview and get in this big swath of time would be I just looked at the clergy laity congresses, which give you a sense of the changes. So the San Francisco clergy laity, the organizers announced that they're going to innovate. They're going to do many new things. And they get very enthusiastic because apparently Archbishop Macarius says, sure, go ahead. Maybe he doesn't know exactly what's in store. And they come up with wonderful, there's James Cornelius is involved, there's Nicholas Petris, and they want a statement against nuclear weapons. They want, I think, something about equality of women. They want a youth festival. And I think at some point, Archbishop Macarius realizes, having said, yes, this is a wonderful moment in which we can kind of regenerate the life of the church, he realizes that these California Greeks are a little bit too way ahead of everyone else, and it just wouldn't stick. That's an example. And so I think, to take an extreme example, the Greek Orthodoxy in California looks very different from Greek Orthodoxy from Chicago and New York. And take it into the heartland of America as well, or not even the heartland, a place like Lowell, Massachusetts, which is an old textile town, which once upon a time had a 50% Greek population. Yay. They're old immigrants. Most of them are third, fourth generation. So they look much different than, let's say, New York. Here in Philadelphia, we've got our churches kind of geographically aligned according to the movement of the Greeks. We had a Greek town in Upper Darby, and there is still Saint Dimitrios of Upper Darby. That's our Greek church. You go further out, and Saint Luke is something between Greek and maybe American Orthodox, choosing my words very carefully here. And as you go out, there's other churches. There's another one in Media, Pennsylvania. So the further out you go, the more American they get.
No, I think you hit on something, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think it's something we've been talking a lot about in this series and in the museum, as we've been trying to sort of talk about where we go from here. I think this question of assimilation, which has all sorts of weight in the current discourse, and in particular, at this moment, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, if you want to share them, on the Greek assimilation into whiteness and the role the church played or did not play in that. I have certainly a sense in my mind that the sort of exoticism of Orthodoxy kept Greeks at some level from whiteness, and that many of the sort of assimilationist moves in the church, things like organs and pews, help that happen. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
So, the whiteness issue is a huge one for the Greek Americans, and in the early part of the 20th century through the 1920s, they were not considered white they were not considered part of the white mainstream. And that's when AHEPA, of course, was established in 1922. And AHEPA, of course, led the Americanization process. But very interestingly, the church followed suit, as you said, exactly, with pews, with taking elements from what people saw here. But in a sense, AHEPA was very deliberate. The church changes organically as its constituents become more white American and Americanized and assimilated. It's got to adapt, otherwise it's not going to be able to attract them. So I think the church is kind of there's a dialectic between the assimilation of the Greek Americans and the church. World War II, of course, is the moment that we have, when Greece fights against the Axis and it's on the same side as the United States, and that's the moment in which, and of course, because the US is fighting against the Nazis, a lot of the racial discrimination talk is dropped, and that's when the Greeks become part of the mainstream, and from then on, they are part of the mainstream and becoming more and more establishment. And let's say it, there's upward social mobility in the 1950s and conservatism in the 1960s and 1970s. And I was struck with the issue of the Greek Americans and the Greek Orthodox Church over Black Lives Matter. I was so heartened and proud that Archbishop Elpidophoros participated in a march in Brooklyn over those issues. Prior to that, everyone was pointing to Archbishop Iakovos's historic march in Selma. Trouble is, he was about the only Greek American there. I mean, there were a couple of other people. There was a young priest. there were a few people who were supportive of Iakovos, but the rest of the community wasn't at the stage that it could sympathize. They still felt insecure. They still remembered the old discrimination and didn't want to associate themselves with a civil rights movement.
No, I think that's, I mean, I think it's a really, you hit on some really interesting things that I think, as the Greek community, I mean, the Greek community has this huge history in the labor movement, for example. As you very well know, in the 20s and 30s, Greeks are very involved in the American labor movement. And then Greeks, as Greeks assimilate, it's, wealth comes into the Greek community, and that, changes their class orientation by and large. Except those of us who studied classics. But I think, along those issues of race, I was, maybe Cairo will cut this, but I was really struck. People who love to put Archbishop Iakovos's picture with Martin Luther King up, how unhappy they were with the current Archbishop for marching with Black Lives Matter. And that, I think, so much of that, I think in part just about general American racial politics. I do think so much of that is about the Greeks' own history with American race and the complicated ways Greeks still relate to whiteness. And so you're an immigration historian, so.
Yes, no, I think, as you know, I think there are vestiges of insecurity, of wanting to, they still think they've got to prove that they're white, and proving that you're white means that you have a negative view of civil rights demands sometimes. and that's just part of the history.
Yeah, no, it's I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
There's a Greek documentarist who's Labrini Thoma, who's gathering information about the discrimination that the Greeks faced in the early part of the 20th century, as a way of reminding everyone where the Greeks were once upon a time ago. It's actually something, it fascinates the Greeks in Greece to learn about the difficulties that the Greek Americans had. But, this is, ethnic groups, they don't, it took a while for Greek Americans to look at their own history. One of my research projects is studying Greek-owned diners. And I'm talking to people who tell me, I started off washing plates. It's the other famous piatades. I think a generation ago, people wouldn't want to discuss that because there was some kind of a stigma, embarrassment that they were washing dishes in restaurants. Now that they're being successful, now that they've achieved upward social mobility, in a sense, a mini version of the American dream, they seem confident enough to go back and look at that past. Likewise, I think the labor movement, the strikes, the mobilizations that many Greek workers participated in, I think people didn't want to discuss those because they were suspect. But now I think we're okay because all of there are no Greek workers anymore to aside from employees and waiters. We don't have a big percentage of Greeks as industrial workers. There's no labor unrest in those areas. It's something of the past. Yeah, we can talk about it now.
I think I get that sense as well. I have one last question for you. We're really appreciative of your time.
Right.
So if you just wanted, if there was sort of, if I can phrase this question correctly, if you were going to summarize, and I know historians are not prophets, but if you could sort of look to the future, I'm going to ask you to prophesy. If you could look to the future, what role do you think the Greek Church has to play in a Greek community that is increasingly, mixed? There are increasingly numbers of mixed marriages. A Greek community is increasingly assimilated. and that, you know, very well may never have that sort of influx of new Greeks ever again. So what do you kind of see going forward?
I see Americanization and assimilation, but I think because of Ligonia and because of other efforts in the past, I think everyone's going to be very careful about doing it organically. In other words, it's going to be a very, very slow process. We won't even be able to notice it. But it's you see it in the other ethnic groups as well. That is not to say that that everything will be lost, if I can say it. I think you know, it's significant that the 2000 census, the U.S. Census of 2000, had that question about, do you consider yourself of any ethnic heritage? I think because this is a multi-ethnic society, precisely because there are other groups that will have strong ethnic identities, the older ethnic groups benefit from the acceptance of the ethnicity of others, and they will hang on to their own ethnicity. It will be heritage. It will be a much not as strong as ethnic identity, but people will say, I'm of Greek heritage. But I do think and I think the actual Orthodox identity will become stronger than the ethnic one. I think that in this kind of constellation, I think you've got traditional ethnic identity eroding along with language. You've got this kind of idea of Greek heritage, which is a little bit of a buffet, because you can choose, you know, is it the ancient Greeks, or is it Mykonos Santorini, is it Yannis Antetokounmpo, is it whatever it is? There's kind of some identification, but you're choosing. And then you've got Orthodoxy, and Orthodoxy will stay. Of course, Orthodoxy may be losing its own Greek language component, but to the extent that Orthodoxy is rooted in a Greek culture, Orthodoxy will be becoming stronger and stronger. You know, I think in 10, 20, 30 years, a lot of there'll be many people who will be identifying as Greek Orthodox rather than Greek Americans.
Oh, that's okay. That is very interesting. That's a very interesting note to end this. Professor Kitroeff, thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely fascinating. Once again, the book will be linked in the bio. And thank you so much for your time. And then Kyra.